come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest. You give them something to eat. How many loaves do you have? And if you look at the narrative, those are the three instigating incidents in the story. It starts because Jesus recognizes the need in himself and his friends to get away for some rest and food. Unfortunately, that doesn't work the way he expected, and the crowds follow anyway, so the disciples ask him to send them away. So Jesus flips the script. Here comes Act 2. If they're hungry, you feed them. Now, at that, the disciples turn immediately to economics, like, how can we afford all this? And they think of real estate. Jesus, do you understand where we are in the middle of nowhere? For them, the idea of responding is a non-starter. Scale of the problem is just too big. Enter Jesus now with Act 3. What do you have in your pocket? And then depending on how you read this story, we either get the multiplication of miraculous bread or we get the miracle of demonstrated generosity that results in contagious mutuality. But in the end, they all ate and were satisfied. So let's take these statements one by one and see what we can learn. Let's get away for some rest and some food. Mark doesn't connect this as directly to John the Baptist as Matthew does. But I think the implication is clear. He puts it directly after that incident, and I think he wants you to pay attention to that. If the Son of God, the CEO of peace, as it were, thinks it's time to take a rest and to get away from the crowds, to find a solitary place to process, maybe it's worth asking why. Here's what I would say. All of us are going to respond to grief or to stress in different ways. And I don't think we should ever put ourselves in this prescriptive box saying this is the appropriate way to be sad. But I do think Jesus knows something that all of our therapists know. That grief and sadness and stress and anxiety, all of that takes a massive toll on our body. Did you know that your brain consumes 20% of your calories in a day? And that's on a normal day when you're not processing the death of one of your very few close friends. Rest, food, space, time alone to process. Stepping back from your obligations to care for yourself. All of these are spiritual disciplines. Disciplines that were practiced by Jesus and modeled for his friends to follow. And if you're anything like me, when things get hard, you want to get busy. That's okay. Not only do I get that, I feel that very deeply. In fact, I like that about myself. But I also know that I can't let that convince me to ignore my limitations, because that's not going to end well. And so when I hear Jesus saying, hey, we need to get away, and we need to find some space, and we need to get some food and some rest, then I want to ask myself, well, what's going on that he's aware of that I need to pay attention to as well? And in this case, in this story, it's grief, but it could just as easily be stress at work, or unresolved conflict in your relationships. It could be the thing you know you need to say, but you're not quite sure how to say it yet. All of that needs attending to. And sometimes it needs lunch. And often that starts with rest. Now, that's good. But life is often complicated, isn't it? Because Act 1 unfolds and it feels very real, but then Act 2 hits, and to be honest, maybe that feels a little too real. Because Jesus wants some space and the crowds don't know how to give it to him. And this is what's really interesting here. The disciples who didn't know that they needed the rest in the first place, they're the ones who are like, well, we got a plan, Jesus. Send them away to look after themselves. And it's Jesus who just called for the rest in the first place. He's the one who's moved by compassion to change course. I think we got to be really careful with this. Because I promise you, every time you think you need a rest, there will be, hot on its heels, a very good reason not to. And we do not want to use Act 2 as an excuse to ignore Act 1. That's a recipe for something very bad. But there are moments where our plans have to give way to compassion. And I wish this story gave us a more clear delineation of when we make that choice. That'd probably be a little bit too tidy and therefore perhaps a little less real, but I will note this from the text. It says that Jesus had compassion on them. And compassion is one of those words that sometimes feels a little bit too nebulous to us. Like, what does compassion mean exactly? When do we respond to compassion exactly? But the Greek here is actually kind of helpful. The word is splagnizomai, and what that means is that Jesus felt their hunger in his splagnon. Now that means his bowels. But the colloquial equivalent here would be something like he felt their hunger in his gut. And I know that's not a perfect hermeneutic for you to decide when to give up your plans or when to sacrifice your needs to care for someone else, but I do think what's important here is that we don't do that because we feel guilty. There's a time to put someone's needs above your own. And there's a time to respond with compassion, but it's not because you feel pressure to do it. And it's not because you feel guilty. And it's not because you're interested in the fawning praise that you might receive somewhere down the line. It's because in that moment, you know in your gut, this is right, and this is good, and this is where God wants me to be. There's a difference between the compassion that moves you and the guilt that pushes you. And sometimes it's very hard for us to know the difference, but I think that Jesus did. And I think we should listen to that.
1 week later.
Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethesda while he dismissed the crowd. After leaving them, he went up on the mountainside to pray. It's only 2 verses, I know, but I do want to stop here for a moment because last week, we saw Jesus articulate the need for him to get some rest in the face of the grief over the death of his cousin. And then we saw him change course to care for the crowd that had come to hear him. And as I said last week, we need to be really careful with that part of the story, because we don't want Act 2 to make us forget Act 1. That's a recipe for something really bad in our lives. There's always a good reason not to rest. But look at this here now. Jesus recognizes that, yes, sometimes we need to change course, and sometimes there are moments where we prioritize someone else's needs over our own. But then as soon as he deals with that, he immediately returns to the original need he recognized in himself to get some rest. Like, please don't miss this here. Even in those moments when you know in your gut that you are where God wants you to be, and that in that moment you are uniquely positioned to offer yourself to someone else in service, and you feel their plight in your splagnon just like Jesus, and God calls you to act with what you have available to you right now in your pocket, none of that eliminates the needs or the limitations or the care that we need to extend to ourselves. There's a time to pivot and change course and pause our plans. There's a time to put your needs on hold, but there's never a time to forget your own well-being. And so here Jesus sets his needs to the side for a time, but he doesn't ignore them. He feeds the crowd, and then he sends his friends off in a boat, and leaving them, he goes up on the mountainside to pray, to rest, to recuperate, but this time alone. And I can't tell you how much I love this moment. Like how much I need this moment in my life, because I know I have a lot of capacity. In fact, I enjoy that. I love my job. This week, I was looking at 2 committee meetings and a wedding and a funeral. There's always a good reason to put your rest on hold. But along comes Jesus saying, pausing is not the same thing as forgetting about. And so do the work, and then do the rest, but make sure you do the rest well when the time comes. In fact, this time, Jesus realizes it's not just time alone with the boys that he needs. Actually, really, this time it's just time alone.
All right, thanks for clicking on that link and for watching through to the end. If you're intrigued by the work that we're doing here at Commons, you can do a few things. You can like this video, you can comment down below. We'd love to hear from you. And of course, you can subscribe to our channel here to stay up to date with all of the things that we are doing and posting here online. We're really appreciative of the fact that you're here. If you'd love to dive more into the conversation, you can join our Discord server, where the community is having different conversations about all the ways that we follow the way of Jesus in the world. Have a great week. Hope you're doing well. We'll see you back here next time we post.